Argument primer. Most research, whether in the humanities or in the sciences, is argumentative in nature. In philosophy, we are especially careful about formulating clear arguments that can withstand critical scrutiny. This lecture is meant to introduce you to some important points of good argumentation. An argument is a device that relies upon evidence to justify the truth of a claim. An argument, as we mean it, does not mean a verbal yelling session. An argument is a bunch of sentences possessing the following form. First, there is the claim you want to justify, which is your conclusion. You justify your conclusion by providing some other sentences called premises. If you are trying to persuade someone with your argument, it's a good idea to select premises your audience is more likely to accept, although this is not necessary to create a valid argument. People in politics, advertising, and so on provide premises that are only meant to persuade. They do not necessarily try to advance arguments that truly justify their conclusions. But philosophers and academics generally do, or at least should, offer premises that actually do attempt to justify their conclusions. Now, there are at least three types of arguments: abductive, inductive, and deductive. We're going to talk about inductive and deductive arguments in this lecture. An inductive argument is one that aspires to be strong. An argument is strong just when, if the premises are true, the conclusion drawn from them is probably true. So consider this very simple inductive argument. Mice get cancer when they ingest chemical X. Monkeys get cancer when they ingest chemical X. So people will get cancer if they ingest chemical X. Now, it seems to me, I mean, I'm not a scientist, but it seems to me that these premises do render the conclusion probable. If they are true, the conclusion is probably true. Because it seems to me, again, I'm not an expert, that mice and monkeys are close enough to us in makeup that if chemical X gives them cancer, it will probably give us cancer. But I realize that there are some differences, and that difference may matter. Now, sometimes inductive arguments have false premises. Consider this argument. Dan frequently drives off the road. One can often smell alcohol on his breath. He has been diagnosed with cirrhosis of the liver. Therefore, Dan is an alcoholic. Now, this is indeed a strong argument for my being an alcoholic. That is because, looking back at the definitions, a strong inductive argument is one such that, if the premises are true, the conclusion is probably true. However, the premises happen not to be true in this case. So this is a strong argument, but not what we'll call a cogent one. A cogent argument is an argument that is both strong and has true premises. Now, consider the example of Jack, a 17th century European biologist who is interested in swans. He travels all over Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, and all the swans he sees or hears about are white. He asks well-traveled sailors about the swans they've seen, and they report seeing only white swans. So he concludes that all swans are white based upon this reasoning. Swans in Europe are white, swans in the Americas are white, swans in Asia and Africa are white. For everywhere any of our sailors have traveled, swans are white there. So swans are white. Now, this is a very strong inductive argument. At the time it was said, it was also a cogent argument because it was strong and the premises were true. But nonetheless, swans in Australia, which was mostly unexplored until the late 18th century, are black. Okay? So the point is that sometimes strong inductive arguments, even cogent inductive arguments, have false conclusions. Okay, so much for inductive arguments. Now, a deductive argument is an argument that aspires to be valid, what we'll call valid. An argument is valid just when, if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. So here's an example of a deductive argument. UMM is in Mexico. Anything in Mexico is north of Minnesota. So UMM, University of Minnesota Morris, is north of Minnesota. Now, obviously, the premises of this argument are false, but that is irrelevant to its validity. This argument is valid because if the premises were true, if the premises were true, the conclusion would have had to be true as well. Now, whether an argument is valid or not depends on whether it has the right form. So consider this strange argument. All bleebs are bloobs. That is to say, if X is a bleeb, X is a bloob. All bloobs are blabs, therefore all bleebs are blabs. Now, this argument makes no sense whatsoever, but it does have a valid form, the form that is called hypothetical syllogism. And here are a few other examples of valid forms. We have a form called modus ponens. Now, these names were given during the medieval age when scholars did scholarly work in Latin. Okay, so these are Latin terms that are fun to remember, so you could impress your family and make them think that you're learning something in philosophy. So you have modus ponens, which has this form. If such and such is true, then such and such else is true. Such and such is true, therefore such and such else is true. Okay, so if P, then Q. P is true, so therefore Q is true. So for instance, a famous sort of substitution for these goes, if it rains, then my yard will get wet. It rains, therefore my yard is wet. Modus tollens, if it rains, then my yard will get wet. My yard is not wet, therefore it didn't rain. A form called disjunctive syllogism, either P is true or Q is true. It's not the case that P is true, therefore Q is true. So for instance, either you are an aardvark or a popsicle. You are not an aardvark, therefore you are a popsicle. Now again, you may say, but Dan, obviously there are some things that are neither aardvarks nor popsicles, and you'd be right. Okay, but that doesn't matter to whether or not this is a valid argument. Okay, because if it's true that everything is an aardvark or a popsicle, and you're not an aardvark, then you're not then you're a popsicle. Okay. Now this premise may be false, right? But that doesn't matter. To show that it's invalid, you need to have the premises be true and yet the conclusion false. You need to imagine a scenario in which the premises are true and the conclusion is false. And if you can't get a scenario like that, it's a valid argument. Now this one's a big mind blower. P is true, Q is true, therefore P and Q is true. Right, so Dan is fat, Dan is bald, therefore Dan is fat and bald. Okay, so it can't be the case that Dan is fat and Dan is bald, and it not be the case that Dan is fat and bald. Okay, now there are some okay, let's talk about two invalid forms that you will see. One is called affirming the consequent, and it goes, if P, then Q. If P is Q, then Q is true. Q is true, therefore P is true. So, using our previous substitutions, if it rains, my lawn will be wet. Hey, my lawn is wet, therefore it rained. Well, can you imagine a scenario in which it's true that if it rains, then your lawn will be wet? You know, there's no big tents over your lawn or anything like that. So let's just grant that this is true. Let's imagine a world where this is true, and let's imagine a world where this is also true. Is it possible that it is still false that it rained? Can you think of any scenario like that? All right. Sure, you know, suppose your sprinklers went off, then is it true that if it rained, your lawn would be wet? Yep, it's still true that if it rained, your lawn would be wet. Is your lawn wet because your sprinklers went off? Yes, your lawn is wet. So it is, these premises are true in this scenario, the sprinkler scenario, and yet it is false that it rained. So we know that this is an invalid argument, and so this form is an invalid form. This one's called denying the antecedent. Now, the reason these have these names is because these types of if-then statements are called conditional statements, and this is called the antecedent, and this is called the consequent of the conditional statement. So this fallacy is called affirming the consequent, because you're saying, oh, hey, because this consequent is true, we're going to draw some conclusion, okay? And this is called denying the antecedent, because the key move here is denying the truth of the antecedent and then trying to draw a conclusion about the consequent from it. So if P, then Q, not P, therefore not Q. If it rains, then my lawn will be wet. It didn't rain, so it isn't the case that my lawn is wet. Again, can you imagine a case where it's true that if it rains, your lawn will be wet, and where it didn't rain, and yet it be the case that your lawn is wet? And again, the sprinkler scenario works here. It's still true that if it rains, your lawn will be wet. And let's imagine it didn't rain, but your sprinklers came on. So it would be actually true that your lawn is wet, but this requires it to be false. So we have a situation where this is false, but yet true premises. So this form is invalid. Right, so what we want from a deductive argument is not just validity. We want the argument to also have true premises. And so when an argument is valid and has true premises, we say that it is sound. Okay. And the most ancient example of a sound argument is this one: Socrates is a man. All men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. All right. So you have just been inducted into a 25th century club of philosophy students who have confronted this argument. Okay, congratulations. So I know this language is a little weird, calling arguments strong, calling arguments cogent, calling arguments valid in this way. You know, so keep in mind this usage. Some people use the phrase valid argument to mean an argument that is good or understandable or reasonable. But that's not how philosophers use the term. There are valid arguments indeed, but that doesn't mean that we should pay any attention to them, like the bleeb and blab argument, right? The premises might be false, or the UMM argument about being north of Minnesota. The arguments may be valid, but just be absolutely ridiculous. Okay, have ridiculously false premises. Philosophers generally don't say when they're doing philosophy that such and such is a valid point. Again, we like to reserve the word valid for arguments. So observations or points cannot, in this usage of validity, be valid, no matter how wise or insightful they are. And philosophers generally do not call an argument true or false, although an argument can be the premises and conclusion can be put into, one sort of statement that is true. Of course, we generally don't say an argument is true. We deal mostly in deductive arguments, and so we mostly just say that they're valid or invalid, sound or unsound. All right, so let's talk about confronting some actual arguments. Consider this argument. Yesterday, it was true that you would wear the clothes that you are wearing today. Next premise. If it was true yesterday that you would wear the clothes you are wearing today, then you couldn't have refrained from dressing as you did this morning. Next premise. If you had free will over how you dressed this morning, you could have refrained from dressing as you did this morning. Next premise. But you couldn't have refrained from dressing as you did this morning. Conclusion. So you didn't have free will over how you dressed this morning. Now, is this argument valid? Is this argument sound? Now, you're probably looking at this argument and really disliking the conclusion that you didn't have free will over how you dressed this morning. So, what do you do? Well, we could start just arguing about, the nature of free will or whether these premises are true or that. But we should focus first on the validity of the argument. Try to figure out if the argument is valid. Okay? And if you work it out, you will see that, well, it is actually a valid argument. Okay? So call this premise A. Yesterday it was true that you would wear the clothes you are wearing today. And then in this premise, we have that statement again, but just buried inside of a conditional statement as the antecedent. So it's if it was true yesterday that you would wear the clothes you were wearing today, so that's our old friend A. Then, okay, philosophers in logic, we kind of represent that with an arrow. Then you couldn't have refrained from dressing as you did this morning. So we could call that's a new one. So we'll call that statement B. All right, this premise 24. All right, we have some new content here in a conditional. So the antecedent, if you had free will over how you dressed this morning. Okay, so we'll call that C. Then you could have refrained from dressing as you did this morning. Oh, that sounds kind of familiar. We heard something like that above, but it was this bit about then you couldn't have refrained. Okay, so it's kind of saying the opposite thing. So it's saying just the opposite. So we're going to call that not be. That little tilde means not. All right. And then last premise, but you couldn't have refrained from dressing as you did this morning. And that we already had here. See, then you couldn't have refrained from dressing as you did this morning. That we've already heard. So that doesn't get a new letter, that's restatement of B. We put B there. Okay. And then you work out the logic and then you see, okay, so this looks we've seen this before. If A, then B, A, right? That's our old friend modus ponens, right? If A, then B. If A is true, then B is true. A is true. So therefore B is true. Okay. Okay. So far so good. And this says if C is true, then not B is true. But hey, B is true. So this is kind of a tricky version of this modus tollens, right? Because it's denying that consequent there. So if C is true, not B is true, but B is true. So it must be that not C is true, and not C is exactly what's going on here. So it is a valid argument. Now this, someone used to dealing with arguments is going to see kind of very quickly that this is a valid argument. It takes maybe a little training to immediately apprehend that this is a valid argument. But arguments get way more tricky. They get tricky such that they're so complicated, even when they're written down in premise conclusion form, that Only, you know, quite good logicians could appreciate quickly whether or not it's valid or not. They, you know, most of us would have to work it out and really go through a lot of effort to prove that it's valid or not. So this is actually a kind of simple one. One of the big difficulties in dealing with arguments is just translating them in the wild, you know, in normal prose into this form. Okay, so it's not easy to tell whether arguments are valid, oftentimes because we're not even really sure about what the person is saying. Okay, and then once we do that, once we figure out whether or not it's valid, we have to go through the hard work of figuring out if the premises are true. And sometimes the premises are really hard to figure out, like in this one. You know, you may not like the conclusion that says you didn't have free will over how you dressed this morning. You probably sense that we're not just talking about how you dress, that if this is true, then it generalizes to everything you do and that we don't have free will whatsoever. So you might not like this conclusion, but it's awfully hard to figure out which one of these premises goes wrong, okay? For reasons I don't need to get into here. I would have to be dealing with you in person where we could talk about it, but there's a lot of this debate about which of these premises is the weakest one. Okay, so it's tough. You know, you don't always know where an argument goes wrong, even a philosophical argument. Okay, let's talk about reason and emotion. Consider this argument. If you're smart, you'll do well in this course. It isn't the case that you're smart, so you won't do well in this course. What do you think of this argument? Well, if you're like most people, untrained in philosophy, you're going to get insulted. You're going to say, wait, you just told me I'm not smart. How do you expect me to respond? You know, go to hell. Who do you think you are? Or, you know, maybe I'm not smart in philosophy, you know, but I'm really smart in biology or physics or whatever. And so how dare you say that, you know, and just they flip out. Okay. But you're not going to make that mistake, are you? No, because you are getting formal training in philosophy, right? And so you are looking at this argument. You're registering that the speaker is insulting you. Yeah, sure. Notice it. I'm not saying don't notice it. I'm not saying don't have feelings. Have feelings, okay? But what you need to do is separate the feelings that you're having from the hard intellectual labor of figuring out whether it's a good argument or not. All right. And before you worry about the truth of the premises, you should worry about whether or not the premises support the conclusion. All right. So this looks to be a valid this looks to be a deductive argument that is trying to be valid. So we have to ask ourselves whether or not it is valid. Okay, so if we put this into, if we symbolize this argument, it's going to look like, you know, if P then Q, not P, therefore not Q. And we've seen that one before, right? That one is, this one here, denying the antecedent, right? So we know that that's an invalid argument. It is possible that it's true that if you're smart, you'll do well in this course. And it is possible that you're not smart. And it is still possible for you to do well in this course, because it may be true that if you're smart, you'll do well in this course. And if you're not smart, you'll do well in this course. Maybe I'm just an easy grader. Maybe I just give everyone A's, right? In that case, it's true that if you're smart, you'll do well in this course, check. And it could be true that you're not smart, check. And still false that you won't do well in this course because I'm an easy grader and give everyone A's. Okay. And so if you were confronted with this argument, you should register that, okay, you were, if not insulted, spoken poorly of by the speaker, but nonetheless, your first thought should be, well, that's an invalid argument. How about this one? If you're dumb, you'll ask for help. You'll ask for help, so you're dumb. Well, what should you do? Should you get emotional again? Should you say, smart people ask for help too, and I shouldn't, how dare you? What type of teacher are you to say that, we shouldn't ask for help, or things like this, right? Well, just calm down and think about what the argument is actually saying. And it's saying that if P, then Q, then P. And ask yourself, is that a valid argument? Before you even wonder about, will I ask for help? Am I dumb? You don't have to even get there. Just think about, if P, then Q, therefore P. What about that? And then you'll reflect in a moment that this seems to have this form. If P, then Q, therefore P. If it rains, my lawn will get wet. My lawn is wet, therefore it rained. No. The sprinklers might have come on. This is an invalid argument. Okay? So, you just point out to your interlocutor that you may indeed be dumb, but their argument is invalid. How about this one? The Bible says that God exists. Oh, we're getting religion in here. The Bible says that God exists. If the Bible says that God exists, then God exists. Therefore, God exists. What do you think about that argument? Well, of course, religion often gets people's hackles up, but let's just wonder about if it's valid before we worry about whether any of the premises are true or whether the conclusion is true. So the Bible says that God exists. Let's call that P. If P, then Q, then God exists. Therefore Q. What do you think? Have we seen that before? We have, haven't we? It's this one. Modus ponens. Okay, these two have been flipped around, right, in order, but it's still a modus ponens argument. And that's a valid argument. Okay. So this argument is valid, period. There's really no discussion about it. Okay. I don't care how stridently atheistic you are. This is a valid argument. Now that may not be, again, I'm trying to, disabuse you of some ways that you might be used to using the word valid. Okay. Just get it through your head that in philosophy speak, this is a valid argument. All right. Now, is it a sound argument? That's the next question to ask. And, then we go just premise by premise. So this premise says the Bible says that God exists. Is that true? Well, yeah, that one's true. Uh-oh. All right, folks. One premise left. If this premise is true in this valid argument, then God exists. Forget about it, right? Game over. If the Bible says that God exists, then God exists. Okay, well, that's obviously a much more controversial claim that we don't need to get into now. But if this premise is true, then indeed God exists. All right, that this argument will have established that God exists if these premises are true, because it's a valid argument. Okay. Now, what if this premise is false? What about if it's not true that if the Bible says God exists, then God exists? Well, does that mean that God doesn't exist? Nope. That just means that this argument will not have established God's existence, but there may be some other argument that does. How about this argument? The Bible says that Porky Pig exists. If the Bible says that Porky Pig exists, then Porky Pig exists. Therefore, Porky Pig exists. All right. So obviously ridiculous argument because it's not true that the Bible says that Porky Pig exists and so forth. But nonetheless, let's think about it. P, if P, then Q. Therefore, Q. That's another modus ponens argument. It is just as valid as the last argument. It is no less valid than the previous argument. Completely valid. Right? Now, this one we know is not sound because it's very easy to establish that the Bible, in fact, does not say Porky Pig exists. So we know this is an unsound argument. This one's trickier. Okay. So, in sum, whether or not you find the subject matter, premises, or conclusions of these arguments offensive doesn't matter. These are arguments. And when someone advances an argument, you, as a rational person, have a very limited decision procedure you must follow if you disagree with the conclusion. Okay, so when it comes to an argument we're looking here at arguments whose conclusions you hate. Arguments whose conclusions you disagree with, at least. All right, maybe disagree with strongly. What do you do? All right, I missed an arrow here. Sorry, there should be an arrow right here. So first, figure out if the argument aspires to be inductive or deductive. Now, we didn't talk about abductive arguments. That's a huge wrinkle. Much more difficult arguments to handle. They may be a subset of inductive arguments. There's dispute about that. But if they are a subset of inductive arguments, then they're a very difficult subset to think about. I'm making things simple. This is just a one, half-hour introduction to reason, to logic. So, don't expect a lot. We're just scratching the surface here. But if it's an inductive argument, ask yourself, does the argument appear strong? Does it seem like the premises, if true, would render the conclusion probable? If it then, if that's the case, then worry about if these premises appear to be true. Okay. And if the argument does seem, if that's right, then it seems cogent. If the argument seems cogent, determine if there's a more cogent argument for another conclusion. That's pretty difficult. But if not, then, well, here's a suggestion. Accept the conclusion and abandon your old belief. All right. Easier said than done, of course, but that is a possibility that you could change your mind. Now, if you can't manage that, at least consider becoming a little more skeptical about the truth of your former belief. Suspend your judgment a little more about your contrary conclusion, okay? Likewise, if the argument appears to be a deductive argument, much easier to tell. Figure out if it's valid. If it's valid, then worry about whether or not the premises are true. And if, as far as you could tell, the premises are true, if you can't figure out anything wrong with the premises, then it seems sound. And again, maybe change your mind about this. Maybe you're wrong, right? Or at least become a little more skeptical, put it on the shelf, can say, okay, I'm going to think about it. I got to digest it, etc. Maybe, I don't know, it's something to think about, right? What you don't get to do as a rational person is just sort of shrug your shoulders and not respond to good arguments whose conclusions you disagree with. You don't get to just forget that you just heard it, cast it from your mind. You don't get to remain as confident as ever about your old belief, convinced that the person who gave you that argument is evil or stupid. You don't get to just have faith in the correctness of your belief contrary to the evidence. You don't get to silence, kill, eliminate, or denounce the person who gave you that argument just because you don't have a good response to it. I think about it like tennis, literally, just as we say, the ball is in your court. If someone gives you an argument, they knock the ball into your court. And it's your job to try to knock it back. And if you can't knock it back, they're winning. They're winning that debate. And you're yelling at them or whatever doesn't make it the case that they're not winning that debate. You're calling them a name or whatever, or you're turning your back on the, walking off the court or any of that. None of that changes the fact that they are winning the debate. Okay. And it's okay. You don't need to win every debate. Okay. You should scrutinize. You should scrutinize not only arguments whose conclusions you disagree with, but you should also scrutinize those arguments whose conclusions you do agree with. After all, your side in some debate only looks worse when bad arguments are promulgated in favor of it. The best thing you can do for your quote-unquote side on any issue is to criticize the poor arguments given for it and advance better arguments in their place. Now, this won't make you a very popular person, I'm sorry to say, because you're going to seem like a traitor to the cause. And being a free-thinking, critical person does come with certain social costs. I'm not going to deny it, okay? But if you're going to play that game, if you're going to try to be that person, that is some of the costs of it. And it may be worth those costs. That's something you have to decide for yourself. Not everyone can get away with it. Some people are so poorly positioned in life, they have to just bite their tongue and stick with their tribe and signal unwavering solidarity to their intellectual tribe or whatever, and never question. But if you do have this sort of good positioning, maybe it's money, maybe it's ego strength, maybe you have a disagreeable personality type that allows you to risk it, then you're going to be better positioned to criticize even your own side and render that side a great service in the long run. Anyway, philosophers hold, or should hold, at least when they have their philosophy hat on, the following principles. We are free to question any idea. We have to learn not to be easily offended when our ideas or values or beliefs are challenged. In fact, we should welcome challenges to our beliefs. Again, that's hard to do. There's only so much you could do in a day of that. It's just like lifting weights or anything else. It's exhausting. You can only do so much, but you get better at it. We in philosophy mode, we are not free to personally attack people. The phrase for this, again, a fancy Latin phrase, so you can impress your parents, is ad hominem, or against the person. So an ad hominem attack is when you attack the speaker, not his or her argument. Okay. So for example, this is fine. Republicans are wrong about X because such and such considerations. That's fine in a philosophy classroom. Here's what's not okay. You Nazi Bible thumping maniacs are out of your minds. That's not okay. That's attacking them. That's just insulting them. That's not attacking their argument. This is perfectly okay in a philosophy classroom. Liberals are wrong about X for such and such reasons. Yep, wouldn't bat an eye. No professor should bat an eye about that. Not okay. You godless perverts, cucks want to ruin the world. Okay, that is just attacking them. That's not attacking their arguments. It's just name calling. Now, I'm not saying that in your private thoughts you may not think, you're not allowed to think these things, or you can't be a good reasoner and think those things or something like that. No, that's fine, right? But those sorts of statements and those sort of personal attacks are not do not conduce to useful discovery or figuring out what's true. Okay. Not just for the sake of the group, but even for yourself. So in philosophy mode, we should note the difference between having a belief and being married to a belief. It's fine to hold a belief strongly, but the key is to hold your beliefs for the right reasons, like they're having lots of evidence for them, they're being reasonable. It's not good to hold a belief for wrong reasons, like your parents taught it to you. Your parents are good people. Your parents sacrificed for you, and they have your interests in mind. And parents are often right. So, I mean, I'm a parent. I'm not trying to disparage parents. I'm not trying to tell you what your parents told you is wrong by any stretch of the imagination. But nonetheless, they're fallible. And the mere fact that they are your parents, as opposed to somebody else's parents or something like that, who are teaching something different, does not weigh heavily in favor of their being right. Or your culture taught it to you. Again, I'm not trying to disparage the culture, but cultures teach all sorts of crazy things. Okay, and just because your culture, teaches you that this is an important value or something like that, doesn't mean it's true. Okay. Nice people, we have this huge bias towards believing what nice people have to say, or pretty people. Very funny, this psychological predilection called halo effect, that you tend to think pretty people or good looking people are more competent than people who are just as good who are ugly. All right. So or consider the idea that look, my life is going to be disturbed if I came to disbelieve this. I'll lose a lot of my friends if I stop believing this, etc. Those aren't good reasons to believe. I mean, those aren't like rational reasons to believe. Okay. It's understandable that we're moved by these sorts of things. We are evolved creatures. We evolved in groups. There are definitely social reasons why we should believe certain things, advantages to it, reproductive advantages and so forth. But insofar as you are interested in being a rational person, you have to try to detect those and compensate for those tendencies and biases. We should first and foremost seek truth and follow it wherever it leads. That is, an intellectual sort of principle, an intellectualist principle. I'm not saying that you should always be this way. Oftentimes what seems true is not true, and the consequences of acting upon it quickly are disastrous. So you should be really cautious about changing your whole life up because you have some new, revelation of things that seem true to you. Okay. But, we're putting on our philosophy hat right now, and, the virtues of the virtues of that, the code of the philosopher, as it were, is to first and foremost seek the truth and follow it wherever it leads, no matter how disturbing that may be. We should allow that we could be wrong about almost anything. We should sometimes try to improve a position we don't believe so as to see how strong it could be, right? So just because your opponents may be doing a bad job of arguing for their view doesn't mean their view is bad, right? Maybe their view is correct. So see if you could improve the arguments for their view. You might find yourself persuaded by what you come up with. Philosophers should be more worried about disabusing themselves of their own false beliefs than convincing others that they're wrong about their beliefs. So it's good to help others, and it's so fun to win an argument or something like that. But you should get past that point as soon as you can, and focus more on patrolling your own um, your own the kingdom inside your own mind, as opposed to other people's, and finding the false beliefs there, and exiling them. And philosophers, and I think researchers generally, should not be intellectually constrained by politically correct rules or traditional norms that our culture teaches. Rather, we should be guided by good method, whatever that is. And good method is tough to figure out what that is. We will talk about good method in ethics in the next lecture. And you're going to pick it up by sort of osmosis as we go through the class, especially if you get a chance to talk to ethicists and engage in what we're going to call reflective equilibrium so often that it becomes muscle memory, right? So rather, we stick with the method. There are various reasons why in polite conversation you should be constrained by rules of politeness, that not to offend people, etc. But nonetheless, if insofar as we are truth oriented, we have to be prepared to say things that are very upsetting not just to ourselves but to other people. Okay, and that's just sort of part of the code of the philosopher.